He thought it was a team dinner, She thought it was coffee with a stranger. Their friends had other plans.
Their families had been planning this for weeks. Neither of them ever stood a chance.
Two guarded hearts. Two little girls who never stood a chance at staying strangers.
6 months. Another deployment. And a question neither of them was ready to answer.
One little girl's question was about to change the course of his entire life.
Nobody warns you that the people who love you most are also the ones most likely to meddle in your POW, in ways that feel, at the exact moment they're happening, like the worst possible idea anyone has ever had. Chief Petty Officer Wade Harmon found that out on a Friday evening in early spring, sitting across a candlelit table from a woman he had never met, in a restaurant his own shipmates had booked under a fake reservation name, realizing with slow, mortified clarity that the casual team dinner he'd agreed to attend was, in fact, a blind date his entire crew had engineered behind his back. He wanted to be furious. He mostly just wanted to disappear. And 6 weeks later, it would be a 7-year-old girl he barely knew, tugging on his sleeve at a birthday party with a paper crown slightly askew on her head, who would ask him the one question that ended up mattering more than any deployment order he'd set. Will you stay? If you've ever had someone else's meddling accidentally hand you the exact thing you didn't know you needed, stay with this story until the end, because what happens to Wade over the following months will make you believe a little more in the strange, clumsy, well-meaning ways love sometimes finds people who've stopped looking for it. And if this story moves you, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe, because we bring you a new one just like it every single week, and we'd love to have you back. Wade Harmon had been in the Navy for 14 years, a chief petty officer with a reputation for calm competence under pressure that had, ironically, done nothing to prepare him for the particular chaos of raising a 7-year-old alone. His wife, Sarah, had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, on an ordinary Tuesday evening while Wade was 6,000 miles away on deployment, and he had learned of it through a static crackled satellite call that cut out twice before he understood what the chaplain on the other end was actually telling him. He had flown home on emergency leave to bury his wife, and had never quite managed to feel like he'd fully returned since, carrying a particular guilt that had nothing to do with fault and everything to do with distance. The impossible arithmetic of a man who had spent his career protecting people from thousands of miles away, and had not been there for the one person who needed him most on the one ordinary evening it mattered. His daughter Lucy had been 5 when Sarah died, and in the 2 years since, Wade had built his entire life around a fragile, careful stability. Shore duty whenever he could get it. His mother Eleanor moving in 3 states over to help during the deployments he couldn't court. A rigid schedule of school pickups and grocery runs and bedtime stories that left almost no room for anything resembling a personal life, which was, Wade had long ago decided, exactly how he wanted it. He had not been on a date in over 2 years. He had turned down every well-meaning setup his sister had attempted, deflected every hint from his mother about getting back out there, and told himself, with the particular stubbornness of a man, convinced his own guardedness was actually discipline, that Lucy needed a father who was fully present, not a father distracted by the complicated math of loving someone new. The guilt, when it surfaced, tended to arrive sideways, in ordinary moments that had nothing obviously to do with grief at all. He would be making Lucy's lunch for school, and suddenly remember, with a clarity that stole the breath out of his chest, the exact sound of Sarah's laugh on the last phone call they'd had 2 days before the accident. A call he had cut short because his watch schedule demanded it, telling her he'd call back tomorrow the way he always did, never imagining that tomorrow would very different voice. On the other end of a very different call, he had gone, in the months after her death, to exactly 1 grief counseling session on base, before deciding, unilaterally and without much self-examination, that he processed things better alone, a switch decision his mother gently and repeatedly questioned, and Wade, just as gently and repeatedly, deflected. He told himself that Lucy's stability was the only thing that mattered now, and did not examine too closely enough how much of his own carefully constructed routine was less about Lucy's needs and more about giving himself a structure rigid enough that grief had nowhere left to slip through the cracks. His crew had other ideas. Petty Officer Reyes, Wade's closest friend aboard ship, and a man who considered matchmaking a personal calling despite a demonstrably poor track record, had spent the better part of a year quietly building a case that Wade needed, in his words, an actual life outside this boat and that kid's soccer schedule. When Reyes discovered, through his own girlfriend's sister, that a local single mother named Claire Bennett had recently and reluctantly agreed to try online dating again after her own sister badgered her into it, the entire crew treated it as a sign from a higher power. Reyes built Wade a dating profile without his knowledge, using a photo lifted from a group barbecue and a bio that leaned heavily on words like loyal and family man that were, if nothing else, entirely accurate. When the app matched Wade's secret profile with Claire's actual one, Reyes did not tell Wade any of this. Instead, he simply informed him that the crew was organizing an informal dinner at a restaurant downtown to celebrate a milestone in their deployment cycle, and that Wade's attendance was, as he put it, mandatory and non-negotiable. Claire Bennett, for her part, had agreed to the date with a similar mixture of reluctance and exhaustion. She was 34, an emergency room nurse who had spent the past 3 years as a single mother after her ex-husband Derek decided partway through their daughter Emma's toddlerhood that fatherhood required a lifestyle he wasn't interested in living, and left for a job in another state with a promptness that still, on Claire's harder days, took her breath away with its casualness. She had built her own careful stability in the years since. Double shifts at the hospital, scheduled around her own mother's babysitting availability, a small apartment 2 blocks from Emma's school, a wardrobe of scrubs she wore so constantly that she sometimes forgot what her own non-work clothes looked like. Her sister, Beth, had spent months insisting that Claire deserved more than a life defined entirely by 12-hour shifts and macaroni dinners, and had finally worn her down into creating a dating profile on a rainy Sunday afternoon. Mostly, Claire suspected, just to get Beth to stop bringing it up at every family dinner. Neither Wade nor Claire had any idea, walking into that restaurant on the same Friday evening from opposite directions, that they had each been maneuvered there by people who loved them and had grown tired of watching them settle for smaller lives than they deserved. Wade arrived first, in his dress uniform, because Reyes had specifically told him the team dinner warranted it, and was shown to a candlelit table for 2 in the restaurant's quieter back section, a detail that struck him as odd for a crew dinner, but not odd enough, in the moment, to make him suspicious. He was 3 minutes into wondering where everyone else was when Claire walked in, wearing the one nice dress she still owned from before Emma was born, looking equally confused to be seated at a table clearly set for a romantic occasion rather than the casual coffee meetup her sister had described. The waiter arrived with a bottle of wine neither of them had ordered, informed them it had been already taken care of by your friends at the bar, and gestured toward the restaurant's front window, where Wade, turning to look, spotted Reyes and 3 other members of his crew, crowded awkwardly behind a decorative planter on the sidewalk outside, giving him an enthusiastic double thumbs up before scattering the moment he made eye contact. Claire, following his gaze, spotted her sister Beth doing something similarly conspicuous from the parking lot, phone raised to photograph the scene from a distance that was not nearly discreet enough. The 2 of them looked at each other across the candlelit table, the full absurdity of the setup landing on both of them at the exact same moment, and Wade, who had spent 2 years perfecting the art of not laughing at anything, found himself laughing so hard he nearly knocked over the unwanted bottle of wine. "I think we've been set up," Claire said, still catching her breath from her own laughter. And Wade, wiping his eyes, admitted that he was fairly certain his entire crew was going to owe him extra duty shifts for this. The tension of the ambush, once acknowledged out loud, dissolved into something easier. The 2 of them united in mutual, amused exasperation at the people who loved them enough to be this embarrassing about it. They ended up staying for the full dinner anyway, mostly out of a shared, practical instinct not to waste a paid-for meal, and found, somewhere between the appetizer and the dessert neither of them had planned on ordering, that the conversation had stopped feeling like an obligation and started feeling like something neither of them wanted to end. Wade learned that Claire worked the overnight shift in the ER 3 times a week, that she had a daughter named Emma, who was obsessed with a specific stuffed rabbit missing one ear, and that she hadn't taken a full day off in longer than she could comfortably admit. Claire learned that Wade had a daughter named Lucy, who insisted on sleeping with the hallway bat on, that he made pancakes shaped badly like dinosaurs every Sunday, because it was the one Seth meal he never missed, regardless of duty schedule, and that he still, 2 years later, sometimes reached for his phone to call Sarah before remembering, in the specific half-second of forgetting and then recalling, that she was gone. Neither of them offered these details as performance. They simply arrived, unhurried, the particular honesty of 2 people who had each spent years being too tired to maintain any pretense at all. They exchanged numbers at the end of the night, not with the giddy energy of a typical first date, but with the quieter, more deliberate caution of 2 people who had both been burned badly enough to know that caution was not the same thing as disinterest. Wade texted first, 3 days later, a simple message asking whether Emma's one-eared rabbit had a name, and Claire's reply, a full paragraph about the rabbit's tragic backstory involving a washing machine incident, kicked off a month of careful, unhurried texting that neither of them rushed toward anything more, both of them acutely aware of how much was actually at stake if this went wrong. Not just for themselves, but for 2 children who had already lost enough. The first time Lucy and Emma met was, appropriately, an accident rather than a plan. Wade and Claire had arranged a coffee meetup at a park halfway between their 2 neighborhoods, intending, in theory, to leave the kids out of it entirely, but Wade's mother had a dentist appointment that ran long, and Claire's usual sitter had a family emergency, and both of them arrived at the park with children in tow, apologizing simultaneously before, realizing the apologies were unnecessary because the 2 girls had already spotted the playground and abandoned their parents entirely within the first 90 seconds. Wade and Claire sat on a bench a cautious distance apart, watching Lucy and Emma construct an elaborate imaginary kingdom out of the playground equipment within 20 minutes, and something about watching their daughters laugh together made the whole cautious, careful pace of the past month feel, suddenly, a little bit silly. Over the following weeks, the accidental park meetup became a deliberate weekly ritual, then a twice-weekly one, then, gradually, something that looked less like 2 single parents, cautiously testing the waters, and more like 2 families slowly, carefully merging into the shape of one. Wade taught Emma to skip rocks across the park's small pond, with the same patient thoroughness he brought to everything, and Emma, delighted, declared him better at rocks than my old dad, a comment that made Claire wince slightly, and made Wade quietly, fiercely determined never to give either girl a reason to make that particular comparison again. Claire, in turn, became the person Lucy ran to when she scraped her knee on the playground slide. A small, unremarkable moment that nonetheless left Wade standing off to the side, with his throat tight, watching his daughter reach instinctively for comfort from someone who wasn't Sarah for what he realized, with a complicated mixture of grief and gratitude, was the first time since the accident. It was not, however, a story without real obstacles, because real life rarely allows redemption to arrive without complication. 6 weeks into what had quietly become a relationship neither of them had formally named, Wade received orders for a 6-month deployment, the kind of routine notification that had once simply been the unremarkable rhythm of his career, and now landed like a small earthquake incest. A life he had only just begun rebuilding. He sat with the orders for 2 full days before telling Claire, partly out of the old habit of compartmentalizing bad news until he'd processed it alone, and partly, he admitted to her eventually, out of a genuine fear that this was exactly the kind of complication that would send a reasonable, exhausted single mother running in the opposite direction, 6 months being more than enough time for someone to reconsider whether a Navy family's particular instability was really worth the risk. Claire's response, when he finally told her over a quiet dinner after both girls were asleep, surprised him. She did not panic or pull away, but she did, with the same clear-eyed practicality that made her good at her job, ask him directly whether this was the pattern his life was always going to follow. 6 months here and 6 months gone, indefinitely, and whether he had actually decided, for himself, what kind of father and partner he wanted to be over the next decade, or whether he was simply going to keep saying yes to whatever the Navy asked of him because it was easier than father. Examining the question, it was not an ultimatum. It was, Wade realized later, the first time since Sarah's Wade's death that anyone had asked him to actually think about what he wanted his life to look like. And rather than simply managing the life circumstances handed to him one deployment order at a solid time, Wade did not have an answer that night. And Claire, to her credit, did not push for one, telling him only that she needed him to actually sit with the question rather than deflect it, because Emma had already lost one father to a decision made without her in mind, and Claire was not interested in setting her daughter up to lose another, however unintentionally. The conversation ended without resolution, and for the following 2 weeks, an unfamiliar tension crept into what had been, until then, an easy and uncomplicated rhythm between their two families, both of them retreating slightly, unsure how to move forward without either of them fully naming what they actually wanted. Those 2 weeks were, in their own quiet way, harder on Wade than any stretch of his actual deployment would turn out to be. He found himself running the same calculations he'd been avoiding for 2 years, weighing the specific gravity of a career he'd built his entire adult identity around against a version of the future he had genuinely, cautiously begun to want, and discovering, uncomfortably, that he did not actually know how to go want something without immediately building a wall of contingency plans around it. A habit that had served him well on deployment and served him considerably less well while lying awake at 2 a.m, trying to figure out how to answer a question a woman he was falling for had asked him with complete sincerity. He called his mother, uncharacteristically, on a Tuesday evening, and found himself telling her, haltingly, about the conversation with Claire and Eleanor, who had spent 2 years watching her son build an admirably disciplined life that was nonetheless missing something she couldn't name, until she heard the specific tightness in his voice describing it, told him plainly that Sarah would not have wanted him spending the rest of his life treating every chance at happiness like a threat to be managed rather than a gift to be accepted. Wade sat with that phone call for a long time after hanging up, and did not call Claire that night, still not ready, but no longer entirely sure his hesitation was actually protecting anyone. It was Emma's 7th birthday party, held in the Bennett's small backyard, with a rented bounce house, and a slightly lopsided homemade cake, that finally forced the question into the open, though not in any way either adult had planned. Wade had come to the party more out of an established habit than any resolved sense of where things stood between him and Claire, standing near the drink table making careful small talk with Beth, while Claire managed the chaos of 7 excited 7-year-olds with the practiced efficiency of a woman who ran actual emergency rooms for a living. It was during the gift opening, Emma tearing through wrapping paper with the specific ruthlessness of a child on her own birthday, that she found the gift Wade had brought, a small telescope, chosen because Emma had mentioned once, weeks earlier, wanting to see the rings of Saturn, a detail Wade had filed away, the way he filed away every small detail either girl mentioned, out of a habit of attentiveness that had nothing to do with performance, and everything to do with the simplistic, unglamorous work of actually paying attention to a child. Emma, delighted, abandoned the rest of her presents entirely to drag Wade by the hand toward the yard's darkest corner, insisting they needed to test it immediately, even though it was mid-afternoon, and nothing was visible except a smudged, distant moon barely worth the effort. Wade knelt down to help her adjust the telescope's tripod, and Emma, apropos of nothing, still fussing with the eyepiece, asked the question that had apparently been sitting in her 7-year-old mind for weeks, delivered with the same straightforward gravity children reserve for the questions adults may spend years avoiding. Are you going away again? Mommy said you have to go on the boat for a long time. Wade, caught entirely off guard, told her honestly that yes, He did have to leave for a while. It was part of his job, and Emma considered this with a small, serious frown before asking the same question that would end up mattering more than any conversation he'd had with Claire over the previous 2 weeks. But will you stay? After? Will you come back and stay? Wade knelt there in the Bennett's backyard, a paper party hat askew on his own head from an earlier game he'd been roped into, looking at a 7-year-old girl who had already learned, far too young, that fathers sometimes simply didn't come back, and felt something in him that had been carefully, deliberately guarded for 2 years, finally, completely give way. He thought of Sarah, of the guilt he'd carried since that static crackled phone call, of the 2 years he'd spent telling himself that staying guarded was the same thing as staying responsible. He thought of Lucy reaching for Claire's comfort instead of his own, not as a loss, but as evidence of exactly the kind of family he'd so tilly, but told himself he no longer had room to want. And he understood, kneeling in front of Emma's small, hopeful, uncertain face, that Claire's question 2 weeks earlier had never actually been about deployments or Navy schedules. At Claire all, it had been asking him the exact same thing Emma was asking now, in simpler, more direct words than any adult conversation had managed. Yes, Wade told her, and he meant it with a certainty that surprised him with how completely it had arrived. I'll come back and I'll stay. Emma, satisfied with the answer in the uncomplicated way children accept promises adults spend years learning to actually keep, returned her attention to the telescope, already moving on to the next demand of her birthday afternoon, while Wade looked up and found Claire standing a few feet away, having clearly heard the entire exchange, her expression caught somewhere between surprise and a hope she had been carefully rationing for weeks. He walked over to her once Emma had recruited Lucy into the telescope investigation, and told her, plainly, that he'd been avoiding her question not because he didn't know the answer, but because saying it out loud made it real, in a way that scared him more than any Sikorsky deployment ever had. He told her he was requesting a shore-duty rotation once this deployment ended, a career move that would mean slower advancement and a smaller paycheck, but 4 years of guaranteed presence, 4 years of Sunday pancakes and school pickups, and actually being there for the ordinary Tuesday evenings that had once, catastrophically, gone wrong without him. Claire, who had spent 3 years building a life around the assumption that she would always be the only steady parent in the room, allowed herself, for the first time since Derek left, to imagine a version of the future that included someone else's steadiness alongside her own. The 6-month deployment that followed was not easy, because deployments never are, but it was different from every deployment Wade had endured before, carried by a specific kind of anchoring he hadn't had in years. Weekly video calls, where Emma insisted on showing him her latest telescope discoveries, which were mostly just the moon, again, but delivered with undiminished enthusiasm each time. Lucy's increasingly confident crayon drawings mailed to him in fat envelopes that took 3 sames to arrive and were worth the wait every single time. Claire's steady, unhurried messages that never once carried the anxious uncertainty of someone waiting to see if he's going to actually follow through on what he'd promised in that backyard. He came home on a gray October afternoon to find both families waiting for him at the airport. Lucy and Emma, holding a hand-painted sign between them that read "Welcome Home," in the specific, cheerful chaos of 2 children's competing handwriting styles. Claire standing slightly behind them with an expression Wade recognized, because it matched exactly what he felt looking at all 3 of them. The particular, disbelieving relief of someone who had spent months not quite letting themselves fully hope for this. He knelt down and hugged both girls at once. Lucy first out of old habit, and Emma immediately after out of a new one that had settled, over 6 months of video calls and mailed drawings, into something that no longer felt provisional or temporary at all. Wade filed his shore-duty paperwork the following week, made official the transfer that would keep him within driving distance of both girls for the next 4 years, and moved, gradually and without any single dramatic announcement, into the rhythm of a blended, unglamorous, deeply ordinary family life. Pancakes on Sundays for 2 girls instead of 1, a telescope permanently set up on the Bennett's back porch, a hallway light that stayed on in Sundin's both houses because it turned out Emma needed it just as much as Lucy did. He married Claire the following spring in a small backyard ceremony, the same yard where Emma had once asked him the question that changed the shape of his entire life. With both girls serving as flower girls in matching dresses they had picked out themselves, insisting on carrying the one-eared rabbit down the aisle as an honorary member of the wedding party. What Wade Harmon ultimately came to understand, standing in that backyard watching his new wife catch a bouquet she pretended not to have been aiming for, is that the guardedness he had spent 2 years mistaking for responsible fatherhood had actually been its own quiet form of hiding, a way of protecting himself from the specific vulnerability of loving someone new, rather than actually protecting his daughter, who had needed, all along, not a father frozen in careful caution, but a father brave enough to let himself be pulled, however awkwardly and however reluctantly, back into the messy, unpredictable, worthwhile business of building a life with other people in it. If there is one thing this story asks you to carry with you, it is this. Sometimes the people who love us see the life we're capable of building long before we are seed, ready to see it ourselves. And sometimes it takes a 7-year-old straightforward, unguarded question to finally ask, out loud, the thing every adult in the room has been too afraid to say. 2 years later, on a warm evening no different in any obvious way from 1,000 others, Wade stood at the kitchen stove flipping his usual Sunday pancakes, badly shaped as always, while Lucy and Emma argued good-naturedly over whose plate deserved the dinosaur-shaped one, and whose deserved the slightly more successful attempt at a star. And Claire came in from a rare day off, dropping a kiss on top of his head on her way to referee the pancake dispute with the same practiced efficiency she brought to every emergency room shift. Reyes still liked to remind him, whenever their paths crossed on base, that he personally deserved partial credit for the whole thing. A claim Wade no longer bothered arguing with, because in the end, it was true enough. However accidentally it had all started. The telescope still sat on the back porch, aimed most nights at nothing more remarkable than the moon. And Wade had come to understand that some of the best things in his life had arrived exactly the way that telescope had. Not through any careful plan he'd designed himself, but through the stubborn, well-meaning interference of people who refused to let him settle for a smaller life than the one he was actually capable of living.